I'm very pleased to welcome Lawrence Wright this evening. He's here to discuss his latest book, The Terror Years, which is a collection of 11 essays that originally appeared in The New Yorker, where he's a staff writer. The work here ranges from some of the reporting he did while researching his Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the development of Islamic fundamentalism, The Looming Tower, and it concludes with a heartbreaking and harrowing piece about efforts by the Atlantic magazine's publisher David Bradley to help negotiate the release of 5 hostages held by ISIS and al-Qaeda, an essay that informs the dedication to this book. Wright is one of those people who's so prolific and multi-talented that it was hard to figure out how to pare this introduction into something manageable. So just to give you a glimpse of some of his work, he's written 5 plays, including Camp David, which ran at Arena Stage, and which he was gracious enough to help us bring a group of Politics and Prose customers to see. He also wrote a one-man play called My Trip to Al-Qaeda, which was later turned into an HBO film. He's written 2 other feature films as well as a novel, and that's in addition to 8 works of nonfiction plus this latest collection. So rather than go on, I'm going to turn it over to our author. Please help me welcome Lawrence Wright.
Well, thank you so much. It's nice to be back here. I've been able to come here many times. I've always felt honored to be able to speak at Politics and Prose. My son was actually a barista here at one point, so there's a family tradition. I confess, I never thought that I'd still be writing about terrorism 15 years after 9/11. But this anniversary has caused me to think about a lot of things, and how it's affected my own life, and how I got started in all this. As a young man, I taught English at the American University in Cairo, and I had no idea how important that would turn out to be. And then in 1998, I had co-written this movie called The Siege. Denzel Washington, Annette Bening, Tony Shalhoub, and Bruce Willis, and it was a movie. The premise of the movie was, what would happen if terror came to America? It hadn't happened yet, What would it be like? How would we react? I mean, it already happened in Paris and London. What if it happened in New York? So that was the premise of the movie. The trailer came out in August of 1998. It's the same month that al-Qaeda had its first attack on America, the 2 embassies in East Africa, 224 people killed. And there was another attack that same month that people don't remember. It was in Cape Town, South Africa, at Planet Hollywood. A bomb went off, killing 2 people. A little girl lost her leg. And the bombers who claimed credit said that they were doing it because of the siege, because of the trailers that were in America depicting Muslims at prayer. And it was devastating. I had written a movie and people were dead. And I didn't feel responsible for it, but still, they might be alive if I hadn't written that movie. So even before 9/11, I was feeling, touched in a sad way by terrorism. The movie came to be seen as a kind of creepy prophecy. All I did was imagine what would happen if there were terror attacks by an Arab group in New York. It was plausible. I decided to research how we'd behaved in the past and how other countries were dealing with their own terrorist problems. And so things in the movie, like rounding up Muslims and the torture scenes and so on, all of those things, one by one, came to pass. And it was very unsettling to me. And there were other weird coincidences that would play a role. the character that Denzel Washington plays, the role, the job, man who had the actual job, was John O'Neill, who was the head of counterterrorism in New York, and he was one of the very first people I wrote about in my research on the development of al-Qaeda. I had been in Austin on 9/11. If you remember, the planes were grounded for a period of time, and I couldn't get to New York. I was desperate to find a way to get into the story. And I started looking at obituaries that were streaming online, and one of them was John O'Neill. He had been FBI's man in New York, but he had the warrant on al-Qaeda, and the obituary made him sound like something of a disgrace. He had been washed out of the bureau because he had taken classified information out of the office, and so he took a job as the head of security at the World Trade Center. So at the time, I thought, how ironic. He didn't get bin Laden got him. As I got to know John O'Neill better in talking to his colleagues and his friends and his many romances, I realized it wasn't ironic. O'Neill told his friends when they said, "John, you'll be safe now," because they tried to bomb it in 1993, and he said, "No, they'll come back to finish the job." So he instinctively placed himself at ground zero. It was a very Greek tragedy, I think. Then I went to Egypt. As I said, I had taught there, and I loved my time in Egypt. I adored my students, and so it was extremely sad for me to see the culture that I was so fond of waging war on the culture that I'm a part of. I went there to write about Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the number 2 man in al-Qaeda, and of course now is number 1. And it was quite striking for me, because at the time we didn't really know anything about Zawahiri. But al-Qaeda was really his organization. Al-Qaeda then, and to some extent still today, is an Egyptian organization. At the time it had a Saudi head on it. But it was a voyage of discovery for me. I was always trying to, when you're writing about al-Qaeda and intelligence operatives, they're not the easiest people to reach. And I was constantly looking for good sources, and I knew that bin Laden had been in Sudan for 4 years, and so 92 to 96 until we chased him out of there. That was a brilliant stroke, and so I went to Khartoum, and I started pressing my Sudanese intelligence contacts for help, and they were a little brusque with me, but finally one day I was staying in this miserable hotel they called Hilton, and at the time I'd been traveling, and my back was giving me terrible problems. And those balls that you blow up and stuff. So I was carrying one of those things. It's problematic blowing those things up every time you land, but. So I was sitting at the desk and working, and there was a knock on the door, and there was one of these Sudanese intel guys, and kind of pudgy man with a conical Indonesian hat, and he was he had a real odd sense of humor, and so they came in, and I let him sit down at the desk chair, and I sat on the ball, and then the Sudanese intelligence agent, his eyes were bobbing. He was so tired. And I said, "Ahmed, just lie down." He went immediately to sleep, leaving me to talk to my first al-Qaeda member. And I said, "Who are you?" He'd just been presented to me. And he said, "Well, you can call me Loe." Okay. And so I started asking him about bin Laden and the creation of al-Qaeda, and he knew everything. I was in heaven. But who is he? How do I check all this stuff? He was telling me about when Bin Laden was first airing the idea of creating al-Qaeda as a kind of Muslim foreign legion, and Loé was saying, and then I said to him, how are you going to get him there? Air France? Ha ha! He might even have slapped his knee. And so I came home, and I began researching, and I found Mohammed Loé Bayazid. His al-Qaeda name is Abu Rida al-Suri, but he was the guy who took the notes at the organizational meeting of al-Qaeda in August of 1988, and he was Bin Laden's business manager. Oh man, I didn't know what a treasure I had, so I flew back to Khartoum, and he wouldn't see me, and that was upsetting. And then I flew back a third time, and he agreed to see me. And I said, Loé, it's a lot of trouble flying to Khartoum. Why didn't you see me last time? He said, well, I didn't know how seriously to take you. The last time I saw you, you were sitting on a balloon. That was my introduction to al-Qaeda. I had spent more than a year trying to get into Saudi Arabia. And they just weren't going to let me in as a reporter. And so finally I took a job. I became an expat worker, which is a language that the Saudis speak. And I got a job mentoring young reporters at this newspaper in Jeddah, which is Osama bin Laden's town. It was the briar patch for me. And usually, as a reporter, you fly in, you stay at the Hilton, you make calls, and you try to make appointments. You hire a fixer, that's the drill. Instead, I had a job, I had a car, I had to go to work every day. I lived in a middle-class Saudi flat, and I had all these young reporters who were informing me more than I could ever imagine about their culture, more than I could ever have learned. It was very chastening about the limits of my craft. And I learned a lot of things about Saudi Arabia and things that I think figure into the radicalization of young Muslims. Terror experts have tried to find the thing that is the source of terror, the source of radicalization. Why do people turn their lives into, why would they go blow themselves up in a fruit market or, kill people in a shopping mall? Why would they do that? And the list of things is quite lengthy. Poverty, poor education, lack of opportunities, unemployment, gender apartheid, tyranny, humiliation. There's a whole list. But not a single one by itself has ever been shown to be the cause of terror or radicalization. And to me, I just think of all of those things as being tributaries in this mighty river of despair that runs through the Arab and Muslim worlds. And I could see it really on display in Saudi Arabia. One of my reporters did a story about a study of depression at King Abdulaziz University, which was bin Laden's alma mater. And I don't remember the exact figure, but a majority of the students at that university displayed symptoms of depression. And what really struck me, 7% of the girls admitted that they had attempted suicide. Now, that would be a remarkable figure in any country. But in a strict Muslim country where suicide is absolutely taboo and that they would admit it, was stunning to me. A number of my reporters were depressed. And I think that, they felt so squelched in their lives. I had three female reporters that I was supposed to be mentoring, but they worked in an office under the stairwell. And I wasn't allowed to see them. And I said, I can't mentor people I can't see. So they finally agreed once a week that they would come up. and to the conference room, and they came in a little black train, and they sat on one side of the table and all the boys on the other, and there was one woman named Najla, and she was a real case. Najla liked covering herself. She went further than she had to. She not only had the abaya, the black robe, and the hijab, she had the niqab, which covered all of her face except her eyes. She used to cover her eyes too, but she kept tripping. And so all you saw these cat eye glasses, and that's all you got of Najla. And she had gloves, the whole thing. One time Najla had to go to Riyadh for an interview, and the interview was before the first flight from Jeddah arrived, so she had to go the night before. Now, as a single Saudi woman, she couldn't travel without the permission of her male guardian, and that could be her father, her husband, her brother, even her son, whoever is the man in charge of her. So she got permission, and as a single Saudi woman, she couldn't stay in a hotel by herself. So she got off the airplane, and the airport in Riyadh closes around 11, so she walked over and sat down, and the guard came around, said, you can't stay here. And she said, this is so Najla, what are you going to do with me? And what could he do? He let her sleep on the floor of the mosque in the airport, and then he turned out all the lights in the airport and locked it up. And then the next morning they turned the lights on, and Najla went to her appointment. And that's what it's like for a woman in Saudi Arabia. But this gender apartheid takes a real toll on the men too. One of my reporters and I went to the mall, and there were a couple of these Saudi women coming down the escalator, totally encased in. Sometimes you can't even tell what direction they're facing. And without a trace of irony, my reporter turns to me and says, check them out. X-ray vision, I'm supposing. One of the lessons I learned from that is that a large part of civilization is learning how to please girls. And this has been taken away from these young men who are so separated from the women in their lives. I was in Saudi Arabia in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. And every Iraqi that I talked to about it was saying to me, are you nuts? Iraq, of all places, nobody should do this. Now, this obviously our policymakers weren't hearing the same thing that I was hearing right there. Honestly, I was ambivalent about it. I had been in a debate with Richard Holbrooke earlier that year, and I was opposed to the invasion. But I didn't think that my government would lie to me about the presence of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. And I didn't know, nor did any of us then, where that information came from. Where it came from was a man named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was a trainer in a camp. He wasn't actually in al-Qaeda, as American intelligence people thought he was. But he had been picked up in November 2001. The FBI interrogated him. They were getting useful information, and then the CIA snatched him, and they sent him to Egypt. Back then, we had other people torture our prisoners, and Michael Scheuer, who was the head of the Alex station, the virtual bin Laden station, remarked, the nice thing about Egypt is you send them there in the morning and you get the answers in the afternoon. Well, yeah, that afternoon the answers came back that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and they were working together with al-Qaeda, and that was the predicate for Colin Powell's infamous speech at the United Nations. My family was scattered around. My wife was in Austin, my son in Chicago, and my daughter was studying in Italy. And they were all part of these demonstrations all over the world protesting the invasion. And there I was right there thinking, well, maybe we should do this. It turned out to be the greatest foreign policy disaster, perhaps in American history. Leaving aside the bloodletting, Afghanistan and Iraq are now the longest wars in our history. And by some, depending on how you count it, $4 to $6 trillion spent on these wars, and especially in the case of Iraq. How did we invest that money? Even Bernie Sanders couldn't have spent all that. But what did we invest it in? We invested it in misery, in creating chaos and insecurity, in growing ISIS and making it into the organization that it is today. Oh, how I wish that hadn't happened. Now, ISIS is often thought of as being an evolution of al-Qaeda. It'd be better to think of them as twins. They were really born at the same time. When I was working on the Looming Tower, I was puzzled why weren't there more people from Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, what we call the Levant. Where were they? There were some, but not very many. And I found that there was another camp in Afghanistan run by a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He and bin Laden knew each other. Bin Laden gave him money, but he kept him at arm's distance because they were very different men. Bin Laden was an international businessman. Zarqawi was a criminal. He was a street thug. He'd been in prison. He had totally different agenda from bin Laden. Bin Laden had an idea of attacking the West, but Zarqawi's goal was to attack the Shiites. He also he wanted to create a civil war inside Islam. He also wanted to establish a caliphate right away. Now, bin Laden had that as a distant goal, but this was, for Zarqawi, this is something that had to be done immediately. And he also thought that Iraq would be a prosperous place to wage jihad. Bin Laden didn't believe that. Iraq was 65% Shiite, and al-Qaeda is an entirely Sunni organization. They crossed paths a lot, but truly the predecessor organization that became then al-Qaeda in Iraq and then the Islamic State, it was overshadowed by al-Qaeda. And then with the invasion and the pressure that we put on the core al-Qaeda, Zarqawi and his minions really came into flower, and they developed this horde that reminds me of the Mongols that we are having to deal with now. I have to say that in the last article in this book is about the Americans who were captured and held by ISIS in Syria. It's the saddest story I ever worked on. And it's hard to go out in the world and expose yourself to these tragedies, but here were the tragedies in some respect were the Americans and their families here in they were average American families. Their kids were idealists. They were journalists and aid workers, some of the finest people you would ever imagine. And our government did such a poor job of taking care of those families. They didn't even tell them about the existence of other families. And when these ransoms were demanded, the government told the families, "We will prosecute you if you try to ransom your child." Can you imagine? Can you imagine if someone said that to you? There was one individual here in Washington, David Bradley, who is a publisher of The Atlantic and several other magazines. And I heard about his efforts to free these Americans and his work with the families. And I really wanted to write about him. There was only one problem. I work for the New Yorker. David publishes The Atlantic. And so I told my editor, David Rimnick, I wanted to do this story. And he said, I don't know. Are you sure? And I said, I was on fire to do the story. And then I called The Atlantic, and they said, well, thank you. We'll do the story ourselves. And I said, no, you can't do that. You can't write about your publisher like that. I can do that. And so there was a lengthy negotiation between my David and their David. And finally, I was granted permission to write one of the most significant stories that I ever had the opportunity to do. Now, I thought that I would talk a little bit just at the end here about where we are. People say ISIS is on the run, and it is on the run. It has a liability in that it wants to have actual territory for its caliphate, and that exposes it to a vulnerability that al-Qaeda doesn't actually have. But that's not saying that it's going to go away, nor is al-Qaeda extinct in any way. The core has shrunk, but the affiliates have prospered and grown. Richard Clark, who was the NSC advisor in the Clinton and Bush administrations, estimates there are 100,000 members of those organizations now, which is far more than there ever were on 9/11. There's a woman here at George Mason, Audrey Kurth Cronin, who did a study about terrorist groups, more than 400. And I think it's useful when we think about terrorism to think of it as something not just about Islam. There's so many different expressions of terrorism. And she found that the average lifespan of a terror organization is 8 years. Well, al-Qaeda just celebrated its 28th birthday, so obviously it's a robust organization. Religiously based terror groups tend to be more durable, unfortunately. Hezbollah's 30 or 34 now. There was one religious organization, the Hindu Thugs, that's where the name comes from. It lasted 600 years, so I'm hopeful we're not in for that. There are different ways of going about eliminating a terror organization. One is decapitation. That's the ideal way. You take out the leader. That worked really well with Aum Shinrikyo when the Shoko Asahara, they had this blind Japanese yogi. All right, it's not just Islam. It could be the genie of terror moves around in the most unexpected places. That was an organization that, in my opinion, would have been far more dangerous than al-Qaeda because of the technical expertise. It was recruiting engineers and scientists largely. Weird cult. They followed the novels of Isaac Asimov. But they were developing a nuclear weapon, and they were poisoning people on the Japanese subway. But with the arrest of Shoko Asahara, it defanged that organization. It still exists, but it's not a threat. It worked very well with the Shining Path in Peru. But we killed bin Laden and we killed Zarqawi, and that didn't have that much of an effect. Those organizations have demonstrated they can survive decapitation. One way is negotiation. It sometimes worked. It worked with the IRA. It took the British Empire 25 years to work out to the Good Friday Accords, but that did work. Negotiations sometimes work. David Petraeus actually posed the idea that we might negotiate with al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, but I don't think that's going to happen. And moreover, al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have these apocalyptic goals that are really kind of non-negotiable. Oftentimes, terror organizations evolve into something else, either a political party or a criminal organization. I think the Taliban could go either way or both. It's a myth that that terror organizations never succeed. They do sometimes. The most striking example is Irgun in Israel under Menachem Begin, which drove the British out of mandated Palestine, and then of course drove Palestinians out of the West Bank. When American troops went into Kandahar in November of 2001 in bin Laden's compound, they found a copy of Begin's autobiography. And I think it was because he was studying how does a terrorist leader go to being a political leader and then going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. It is. But, you know, that was also an inspiration for Nelson Mandela, who was consciously modeled the terror wing of the African National Congress on Irgun. So sometimes they succeed. We can't let that happen with al-Qaeda and ISIS. So repression is one way that terror organizations are stamped out. In Egypt in the 90s, there was savage combat between jihadist groups and the Egyptian government, which spared nothing in terms of eliminating these groups. And the same thing with Putin in Chechnya. America's not that kind of country. So that only leaves us one alternative, and that's failure. These groups have to fail. And most terrorist organizations do fail and will fail. But I fear in the case of al-Qaeda and ISIS and its progeny that they will be with us for quite some time. I am concerned about two things. One is the evolution of technology, much of which we created ourselves. When I was writing about the Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, previous director, I got to meet one of the guys that develops the, like Q and James Bond. They didn't get to, they wouldn't show me the stuff, but I really wanted to see. But he said one of his concerns was that high school students that are now making computer viruses will soon be able to manufacture actual biological viruses. That is very concerning to me. We have drones flying over the White House fence. Hezbollah is now using armed drones in Syria. So we've unleashed technology to combat some of these problems, but the backlash is always very dangerous. And the other thing that concerns me quite a lot, and I feel is going to be a problem for our future, is the refugee flow. The entire Palestinian diaspora was 750,000 people. And think of all the unhappiness that they experienced and how much misery has been caused in the world because of it. 5 million Syrians out of their country right now. And they're just part of a larger flow from Afghanistan and Nigeria and Libya. The world is awash in desperate people. And when I spoke about despair being the general term that one can, this is a repository of despair for generations to come. UNICEF says that only 20% of the children are being educated. So if you were a 5-year-old child in 2011 when this civil war began, you've lost your entire elementary education already. What does life have for you? What is your future? I think, we all have anxieties about bringing refugees into this country because refugees are different from immigrants. They usually arrive with nothing but the traumas that they've experienced. But leaving them alone is a greater danger, in my opinion. I thought I'd conclude by spoiling the end of the book for you. There's a little, if there's something that you take away from this event, I'd like for you to remember this particular passage. One day in 1965, I took a date to the airport. I was a senior in high school in Dallas, Texas, and I didn't have enough allowance to go to the movies. Love Field, as it is actually called, was a common destination for cheap dates. An American Airlines jetliner had just arrived from some exotic locale, Paris, we supposed, and my girlfriend and I walked out on the tarmac and climbed into the ramp onto the plane. The flight attendants were cleaning up as we sat in the first-class cabin. One of them actually gave us a snack. After that, we went up in the FAA tower. "Come on in, kids," a flight controller said as I cracked open the unlocked door. We sat on stools and watched the landing lights of the incoming flights like fireflies on a summer night. That America is gone. Terrorism killed it. That America is not remembered or even imagined by younger people who have never experienced such freedom and have no way of calculating the many sacrifices of liberty that have been made in the name of the war on terror. The age of terror will end one day, but whether our society can restore the feeling of freedom that once was our birthright is hard to predict. The security state that has grown up since 9/11 has transformed our culture, and yes, we have needed the protection. We are often reminded that we must never forget what happened on that fateful day. But if we fail to keep in mind the country we were before 9/11, we may never steer in that direction again. In that case, the terrorists really will have won. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yes, sir.
I'd like to know what you think of the legislation sponsored by Republicans in Congress to allow survivors of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia.
The question was what I thought about this, the legislation just passed in the Senate and the House to allow family members of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia. And it wasn't just Republicans, by the way. Chuck Schumer was a co-sponsor. So it has bipartisan support. In short, I'm very opposed to it. I think a lot of politicians voted for it with the idea that Obama would veto it, which he says he's going to do, but they have enough strength to override his veto. If there's one country that needs protection from sovereign immunity, it's us. You think about all we are involved in so many other countries, and just take the drone strikes alone. I am actually in favor of the drone program. It's far less bloody than actual troops on the ground. War is a very bloody business. But if every civilian we kill accidentally is able to sue the American government, we do pay blood money, but our actions all over the globe could wreak unbelievable legal consequences. So I think it's a very short-term strategy. But I also think we're kind of scapegoating the Saudis. I do hold them responsible for spreading this wicked permutation of Islam all over the globe. They do bear moral responsibility for the spread of terror in the world. And I also think, that they, on the 9/11 thing, I think that they were the two hijackers that came to America in January 2000, 20 months before 9/11. I feel like I'd like to know more about that. Why the CIA, which knew about them being in America, didn't tell the FBI. I write about this in the book. It's absolutely insane that nobody's been held accountable. Think how the world would be different if 9/11 hadn't happened, and it might have been different if the CIA had told the FBI. But I think that they were letting the Saudis run these guys. You can read my perspective in the book, but I think that they had a sense that the CIA wasn't allowed to run operations in the U.S., and so they were letting the Saudis run their own people, watch over these two al-Qaeda guys. And when they finally told the FBI a couple of weeks before 9/11, why did they tell the FBI? Because they lost them. When you lose two al-Qaeda guys in America, who do you go to? You have to go to the FBI, and it was too late to find them. So, I would think, we could start by examining the people that should be accountable in our own country before we go scapegoating the Saudis.
Yes, I didn't.
Sorry,
All
I didn't
right.
know.
So one thing I can't help ignore, I notice a lot, is this vicious political cycle that the Middle East is caught in. So in your Looming Towers book, you go from Sayyid Qutb to Sadat's assassination and then Muslim Brotherhood, and they get back Mubarak. And now you look at modern times, they go from Mubarak to Muslim Brotherhood and back to Sisi.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like this is a vicious cycle that keeps repeating. And I'm kind of curious to know what you think about the whole politics of Egypt and the role it has played in this in the current situation.
Well, Egypt has long been, in many respects, the most important Arab country. It's the most populous, and it's had a, unlike a lot of the Arab countries, it has an eternal sense of itself as a nation. It's not going to split up, like Iraq might, or Syria or Lebanon, or any of these fractious countries might one day break apart, and it might be good for them, but that's not going to happen in Egypt. I honestly was wrong about Egypt. I thought that it was ready for democracy. And in 2008, right during this period of time, well, but earlier, during the primary season, I made a speech at Cairo University. It's the same place that Barack Obama would later go address. And they were all following the American election avidly. And so I said, well, how many of you guys would vote for Hillary Clinton if you had the chance? And all these girls on hijab, raise their hand. How many for Barack Obama? Everybody else. How many for John McCain? One guy from the embassy. Those were the same kids that were in Tahrir Square a few months later. And I can't prove it, but, we often talk about American power. And we were talking about it. Normally what we mean is military power or economic power. But there is the power of our example. And in that election, I think those kids were deeply moved by the sight of profound social change coming about by nonviolent means. And that's why that was a prod for them to go into the square and try to make that happen in their own country. Now, they were naive. They weren't prepared. They didn't have an agenda. They didn't have a party. They just had an urge. They wanted to make Egypt a modern democracy. But there are really only two institutions in that country. It's characteristic of a lot of countries in the Middle East. There is the mosque and there is the army. And the students were neither. So they didn't really have a chance. They had a revolution. The Muslim Brothers seized control of it, and the army seized control from the Muslim Brothers shortly before there was to be another national election, which would have thrown Morsi out of office. It was a tragedy. And I have two thoughts about the future. One is that many of these countries have now looked in the abyss, and they're not going to try to change anything for a while. I certainly think that's true in Egypt. They're paralyzed with anxiety. But I don't think the Arab Spring is over. Mentally, I think it's still, those young people are now older, but it's the only hope when I talk about ending al-Qaeda. One day, those people are going to be back, and it won't be necessarily in the streets, but they will be able to take control because for a moment, they had it, and I know that that'll come again.
You've already alluded to what I believe was reference to Saudi Wahhabism and the vigorous spread and financing of Wahhabism around the Arab world and elsewhere. I'd like your view as to how the United States and Western countries should respond to that, and what appears to be its continuing impact even on Saudi domestic policy, including, in essence, the execution of a prominent Shia leader in that country, and what that forebodes for instability, in a variety of realms.
We're in a transition moment with Saudi Arabia, and it's an awkward transition. For one thing, is a part of this Sunni-Shia civil war of Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen, and the U.S. is providing targeting and refueling for. In the Arab world, it's known as the Saudi-American war on Yemen. So I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors there. It's one of it's the poorest country in the Arab world. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia has been built on the premise that they were always going to be rich. 80% of their revenue comes from oil. And when oil's $100 a barrel, that's terrific. But I don't care what you think about fracking, but man, has that changed the world. American production just shot up in the last 7 or 8 years. And we no longer have the kind of dependence on Saudi Arabia. Moreover, shale is one of the most common elements in the whole world. It's not just Texas and Pennsylvania. Other countries can do this. It was profitable at $60. And now the technology has moved it down to about $40. So I think that it's going to be a long time before the price of oil goes back up to the point that Saudis can throw money around. That is profoundly changing that country, and they're now having to re-examine who they are in the world. And I think this is all for the good. I hear good things about their, they're trying to scold their imams and re-examine the tradition of using Wahhabism as a club in the world to advance their interests. I don't know how, there's a saying in Saudi Arabia, reform without change. And so we'll see if that follows that path. Yes, ma'am.
Syria is such a tragic mess. How do you see that playing out? I mean, everybody is on all sides. We're on the side of the Turks, and we're on the side of the Kurds, and there's ISIS, and there's al-Nusra, and Hezbollah. Can you see any way, or what do you think will happen?
Well, first of all, I don't know, but I'll tell you my experience there.
Mm-hmm.
I have this in this book. The Middle East is a great place for reporters. Talk. People love to talk. And I realized that I wasn't hearing anything from Syria. This was 2006. And it was like the dog that didn't bark. And I went to speak to my editor and said, I wonder why Syria is so quiet. And he said, that's not a story. Obviously not. But it's interesting. So I decided, people all over the world learn about America through our movies. So I would go to Syria, watch their movies, and talk to their filmmakers and find out what's going on with their culture. And what I found in common in all the movies and in everybody I interviewed was physical abuse. Everybody I met had been beaten by their parents, by their teachers, by the police. It was a culture of abuse. It wasn't just one dictator. It permeated the whole society, and it was so traumatized even before the Arab Spring. And my fixer was a lovely young woman, and her parents were both in political prison, her mother for 2.5 years, her father for 13 years, tortured, kept in isolation, finally gets out, comes home, and what does he do? He beats her up repeatedly, sends her to the hospital, and locks her in her room. There was one young Syrian woman who I met who was Alawite, the same sect as the Assads. And she ran away to join the revolution. And her father said, if you don't come home, I'm going to kill your mother. And she didn't come home, and he killed her mother. Well, I think you have to appreciate the level of trauma in these societies. The idea that we can go in and change societies that are that wounded is very prideful on our part. And so I hope that this truce holds. Eventually these civil wars bleed out. But our job now is to try to contain it as much as possible. In one case, I think that both Obama and I now agree with Donald Trump that we should work a little bit more closely with Russia. The Russian border is 600 miles from Syria. That, from a Texas point of view, that's the same distance from Austin to El Paso. So, they have a deep interest in that we have to respect. And I think that forming an international alliance to try to bring this to a close and contain the flow of refugees is the first order of business. Yes, sir.
Mr. Wright, I have read several of your books with great interest, and my question is as follows: what would you say are some of the most profound and meaningful ways in which your experiences living overseas influenced and impacted the content of your books?
Well, yeah, I was lucky when I was a young man. It was a weird thing. The Vietnam War was going on. I was a very inexperienced young man, but I was opposed to fighting in Vietnam. Even though I'd been in ROTC, I was very confused. And so I applied to become a conscientious objector, which meant that I had to do 2 years of alternative service. And I didn't expect to get it out of Dallas, Texas, but suddenly I did. And the requirements were you had to be 50 miles from home. And that was all right with me. I wanted to get as far away from America as I could at the time. It had to be very low paying, and it had to be in the interest of the United States. So I went to New York. I thought I'd get a job at the UN, and they'd send me far, far away. And they said, no, we don't do that. But here's a list of American institutions abroad. And one of them had an office across the street. At 866 UN Plaza was the office of the American University in Cairo. And I didn't know we didn't have any diplomatic relations with Egypt. I didn't know there were like only 200 Americans that were in the entire country. I didn't know the president of the university was a CIA agent. I don't even think I knew what language they spoke in Egypt. And I'd heard about the 1967 war, but it wasn't the war that was on my mind. So I walked across the street. And 30 minutes later, they said, "Can you leave tonight?" Well, no. My girlfriend's back in Boston. I haven't told my parents what I'm going to do. Can you leave tomorrow? Yeah, I can go tomorrow. So I went back to Boston, and I said to my girlfriend, I'm going to Egypt for 2 years, and I don't know where that leaves us. I called my parents from JFK, and I flew to Cairo and landed at midnight, and I taught my first class at 9 in the morning. Now, that was a splash of cold water. Welcome to the world. I had no idea how the rest of the world lived. I adored my students. They were so sweet. I had a wonderful time when I was there. But it was the most, in many ways, the most important thing I ever did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Yes, sir.
You've written a lot about our fight against terrorism, the Bush administration, the current Obama administration, even before. I'm just curious what your general assessment is of how successful we've been, and if there are structural things that you've seen that have not changed across administrations that you think should.
Well, when we talk about success, you have to take into account also that invasion in Iraq it made so much difference. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is correct the problems that we've caused for ourselves. And I think it's important for us to understand that terrorism doesn't really pose an existential threat to the United States, but the consequential damage that's been done are actions that we've taken. So we have to be, I think there is a kind of consensus in the Obama administration that aligns with what I think is, contain the problem as much as possible. Don't go putting, massive armies on the ground in another Arab country. I also feel that we were wrong to go into Iraq. We broke that country apart. It was wrong for us to leave, but we honestly were told to leave. I don't blame Obama for having to live up to the agreement that the Bush administration made with the Iraqi government that we would have to leave. Maybe we could have pressed the case more strongly, but Iraq in our absence has certainly gone to pieces. In Afghanistan, I think, it's been a miserable, lengthy war, but on balance, I think we should keep a residual force in Afghanistan long enough. It's just state the terms. We're going to stay until there's a settlement, and rather than constantly giving deadlines, that we're going to. So the Taliban are just waiting us out at this point. And truly, if we leave, they'll take over the country really quickly. And then what would it all have been for? I think that there is a possibility of a peace agreement in Afghanistan, but we'd have to show that we acknowledge that it's going to cost us something. But the catastrophe that we've visited on that country, we owe them something for that.
Okay. What kind of organization can you legitimately call an al-Qaeda affiliate, and what kind of relationship does it have to have with al-Qaeda to be called an al-Qaeda affiliate?
So did you hear the question about what is the relation of al-Qaeda affiliates to al-Qaeda? For one thing, they swear what they call bayat, which is a pledge of fealty to al-Qaeda. In part, it's just just like people pledging allegiance to ISIS. It's like a pirate flag that they run up the mast. But it also signifies that they support the goals of al-Qaeda, and that means attacking the West and trying to drive Western countries out of the Middle East. If you support an immediate caliphate and civil war within Islam, then you would pledge allegiance to ISIS. So these are two competitive, in a way, organizations. They're loosely aligned, but they follow what we could generally term bin Ladenism.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's it.
All right. Yeah.